Hi and welcome back. We're now in part 5 of the basic principles of applied behavior analysis, and we're talking about the ABCs of ABA, the antecedent, behavior, and the consequence. And we talked about the consequence and positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment, and also extinction and differential reinforcement. Then we went over the antecedent stimulus and talked about building good stimulus control, or the discriminative stimulus, the SD, and also building instruction control. Now we're going to get into the behavior a little bit more itself. And when we talked about previously behavior, we said there's two ways of talking about behavior. We said we could talk about the behavioral excesses and also the behavioral deficits. There's also two other ways we can look at behavior and talk about behavior. And many people, when they talk about behavior, they talk about the topography of the behavior. When I say the topography of the behavior, if you ever seen a topographical map, it's that map with all the squiggly lines on it. What it shows is the physical characteristics of the landscape. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the topography of the behavior, is what the behavior looks like. But more important than what the behavior looks like or what it might be classified as, or the topographical response class, what might be important is looking at the functional response class of a behavior, looking at the function of the behavior. So instead of being way too concerned about the behavioral excesses and be more concerned about the behavioral deficits, we also want to make sure we're not too concerned about the topography of the behavior and write behavior plans based on the topography of the behavior, and be more concerned about what's the function of the behavior. So when we say the function of the behavior, what we're talking about is the relationship between the behavior and its consequences and antecedent conditions. In other words, under this particular condition, I behave this way and I get this particular reinforcement. So we're kind of putting it all together, behavior and the antecedents and the consequences and the relationship that it has between all those three. So when we say the function of the behavior, what are we asking? We're asking basically, what's maintaining the behavior to continue to happen? Why is this behavior continuing to happen? And what maintains behavior is reinforcement. And so are they trying to get to something? Are they trying to get away from something? And what are the antecedent conditions that have stimulus control over the behavior? So what maintains behavior is reinforcement. And there's two types of reinforcement. There's positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. So positive reinforcement is where children are trying to get access to a particular stimulus, or we all behave to try to get access to a particular stimulus. And so access to positive reinforcement can be automatic or socially mediated. And we look at automatic reinforcement. Here we're looking at those self-STEM behaviors that children with autism might engage in, such as hand flapping, where they automatically provide themselves with some kind of reinforcement. And we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But if it's not automatic reinforcement, then that means somehow it's socially mediated. It's mediated through us, through adults or other people. So it can be access to a particular object. They're throwing a fit because they want the iPad and they want you to give them the iPad. Or they're trying to get socially mediated access to a particular activity. They want to go outside and they want to go play on the swing. And so they're throwing a fit for you to take them outside and engage in the activity of going to the playground. Or they're trying to get access to attention. They're throwing a fit in the other room so that you'll run in and try to help them with whatever they need. So here's a good point to talk about self-stimulatory behaviors, or commonly called SelfStim behaviors. And why do children with autism have more self-stimulatory behaviors than typical developing children? Well, there's a number of different reasons, and we're going to go over those. So here we are in positive reinforcement, and that's what self-stimulatory is. It's the addition of a stimulus, some kind of stimulus that they're accessing, and it's not in no way socially mediated. So it's automatic, of course. It's automatic positive reinforcement. And that's a better way of kind of looking at self-STEM behaviors, and that's what they're doing, is when they engage in hand flapping behaviors or looking at things in a different way, they're automatically providing themselves with some type of reinforcement. And the reason why children with autism might be more prone to automatic positive reinforcement is because they're not any unlike us. We're all creatures of reinforcement. We will seek out reinforcement if it's not provided to us. And we have access to a lot of reinforcement that aren't in a lot of children's lives for a number of different reasons. One of them is a lot of the reinforcement that we get as adults is social reinforcement. And even a bunch of typical children, if you saw them on a playground, a lot of reinforcement that they're accessing through that activity is social reinforcement. And that's just one of the things about children with autism. They just don't find social reinforcement as darn reinforcing. That's the whole first part of the diagnostic criteria of children with autism. And so that's one of the aspects of self-stimulatory behaviors, is there's a whole lot of social reinforcement that they're not able to access. And there's also other reinforcement that they're not able to access as well, because of the social reinforcement problem. Well, what behavior is maintained by social reinforcement is language. Language is maintained by social reinforcement. So if they don't find social reinforcement as darn reinforcing, then they're not going to engage in that behavior as much. So that's why many children with autism are language delayed. And so children with autism that are language delayed and don't have the ability to come up to an adult and say, hey, I would like to go out and play on the swing, please. That's a lot of reinforcement, and that's how a lot of children get reinforcement in their lives, is through adults. They have to ask us for that reinforcement. A child that's language delayed and doesn't have that ability, that's again a whole nother section, a whole a group of reinforcement that children with autism aren't able to access. And the third reason is a lot of children with autism have a lack of appropriate play skills. And so again, if you watched a bunch of children in a daycare setting, they're playing with the airplanes and they're playing with the car toys and the dolls, and they have the ability to access reinforcement through these items. So children with autism that don't have appropriate play skills, that's a whole lot of reinforcement that they're not able to access. So you put it all together with all the social reinforcement that they're not able to readily access, that many typical developing children are, or the lack of language to be able to ask for appropriate reinforcement, or all of the play skills that they're not able to have to find reinforcement in typical items that children might play with. So you put those all together, that's a lot of reinforcement that a lot of typical developing children are able to access. And again, they're not unlike us. If they're not provided with that reinforcement, then they'll seek out other reinforcements, and a lot of times those end up becoming self-stimulatory behaviors. So that's our job with automatic reinforcement, is do all we can to make social reinforcement much more reinforcing, teach language skills so they have access to appropriate other reinforcements, and teach play skills so they have access to more activities, reinforcing activities that they can do in a more appropriate and productive manner. So these are the two first functions of behavior, with socially mediated positive reinforcement or automatic positive reinforcement. So if it's not for positive reinforcement, then it must be for negative reinforcement. And negative reinforcement, again, is the removal of a stimulus that increases the behavior. So here's where children are trying to escape or get avoidance of a particular stimulus. And again, it can be automatic or it can be socially mediated. There's not a whole lot of automatic negative reinforcement. The best example is I have an itch, and so I gauge the behavior of scratching myself, and that removes that stimulus. Or perhaps I have a headache, and so I gauge the behavior of doing this, and that removes that internal stimulus. So some people think that head banging might be automatic negative reinforcement, that it removes some kind of stimulus that they might have internally that we can't see. But if it's not automatic negative reinforcement, then it is socially mediated somehow. And most negative reinforcement is socially mediated. And a lot of negative reinforcement for children is demand related. That you ask them to engage in this particular demand, or you said, come here, let's do some work, and they flop or they engage in all this behavior to get the removal of that demand. Or you say, hey, it's time to do your homework, and they engage in a lot of behaviors because they don't want to do their homework. Or they try to get the removal of a particular stimulus. Some physical aggression might be social mediated negative reinforcement, the fact that you have a child that's playing with their blocks, and some other child comes and knocks down their blocks. Well, right now that child is saying, I don't like your stimulus. So it's a fight or flight kind of issue. Either I'm going to leave, but I'm not going to leave because my blocks are here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit you so that you go away. So it's the removal of a particular stimulus. So that's the second two functions of behavior: socially mediated negative reinforcement and automatic negative reinforcement. So those are the four functions of behavior. Again, the functional relationship between the behavior and its consequences and antecedents conditions is socially mediated positive reinforcement, automatic positive reinforcement, socially mediated negative reinforcement, and automatic negative reinforcement.